In September 1941, a dark shadow fell over the golden spires of Prague. For 2 years, the Czech people had lived under Nazi occupation, but they had managed to keep a flicker of defiance alive through strikes and sabotage. Adolf Hitler was losing his patience. He needed a man who could break the Czech spirit once and for all. He chose the most dangerous man in the Third Reich, Reynxard Heydrich. Heydrich was not a typical Nazi thug. He was a cold, aristocratic intellectual, a master of the violin, a champion fencer, and the primary architect of the final solution. When his black Mercedes pulled up to Prague Castle, the atmosphere in the city changed instantly. The wind seemed to grow colder. He was the blonde beast, and he had arrived to transform the protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia into a silent, efficient engine for the German war machine. The butcher's arrival was marked by a chilling strategy known as the carrot and the stick. Heydrich understood that to control a nation, you had to crush the leaders and bribe the workers. Within hours of his arrival, he declared martial law. He didn't waste time with trials or long interrogations. He rounded up the intellectual elite, the mayors, the teachers, and the leaders of the Sokol movement. The stick was brutal. Executions began immediately. The sound of firing squads became a rhythmic pulse in the outskirts of Prague. Heydrich personally signed death warrants, burning him the terrifying nickname, the Hangman. He wanted the Czech people to know that the cost of resistance was a bullet to the back of the neck. But then came the carrot. Heydrich increased food rations for factory workers. He gave them better shoes and organized spa retreats for the laborers who built the tanks and guns for the Wehrmacht. He was a master of psychological manipulation. He wanted the workers to be well-fed and docile, while their leaders rotted in mass graves. He famously said, "I don't need the Czechs to love us, I only need them to work." As Heydrich walked through the halls of Chechoslovakia Castle, he famously looked at the crown of St. Wenceslas. Legend said that any usurper who placed the crown on his head would die within a year. Arrogant and untouchable, Heydrich reportedly placed the crown on his own head, mocking the local superstitions. He felt like the king of Prague, a godlike figure who had successfully silenced an entire nation. From the outside, it looked like he had won. The streets were quiet, the factories were humming, the resistance seemed broken. But beneath the surface, the hangman's brutality had created a desperate, burning hatred. In London, the Czech government in exile watched in horror as their culture was systematically erased. They realized that if Heydrich stayed in power, there would be no Czech nation left to liberate. The butcher had arrived, and he had turned Prague into a graveyard of silence. But in that silence, a plan was being born. Thousands of miles away, in a secret training camp in the British countryside, 2 men were preparing to jump into the dark. The butcher's reign had begun, but the countdown to his end had started the moment he stepped onto Czech soil. In the late hours of December 28, 1941, a 4-engine Halifax bomber roared over the English Channel, cutting through a thick veil of winter clouds. Inside the vibrating fuselage, bathed in a dim red light, sat 2 men who carried the weight of a nation on their shoulders. Jan Kubiš, a Czech, and Josef Gabčík, a Slovak. They were not elite commandos by birth, but ordinary soldiers transformed by the British Special Operations Executive into the ultimate instruments of vengeance. Their mission was codenamed Operation Anthropoid. Their target? The blonde beast, Reynxard Heydrich.
The flight was a perilous gamble. Navigating through Nazi-occupied Europe without radar, the pilot struggled against shifting winds and blinding snow. Gabčík and Kubiš sat in silence, checked their parachutes for the 10th time, and felt the cold air biting through their flight suits. They carried Sten submachine guns, modified grenades, cyanide capsules, and enough forged documents to move through the shadows of Prague. They knew the statistics. Most agents dropped into the protectorate did not survive the first week. 10 minutes to the drop zone, the dispatcher shouted over the roar of the engines. The drop was supposed to happen near the town of Pilsen, where local resistance contacts were waiting, but as the hatch opened and the freezing wind screamed into the cabin, the pilot realized the navigation was off. They were miles from their target, over the snowy woods of Nechvisti, just outside Prague. There was no time to turn back. "Go! Go! Go!" Gabčík and Kubiš plummeted into the abyss. The snap of the silk parachutes was the only sound in the frozen night. They drifted down into a landscape of white silence, landing heavily in deep snowdrifts. As they gathered their chutes and buried them beneath the ice, the reality of their isolation hit them. They were alone in the heart of the Third Reich's most efficient police state. Every window could hold an informant, every shadow could hide the Gestapo. The first few hours were a test of survival. Gabčík had injured his foot during the landing, a setback that could have been a death sentence. Limping through the snow, they sought shelter in a garden shed, shivering as they waited for dawn. They didn't know the terrain, and their contacts were miles away. This was the raw, unglamorous side of espionage: hunger, bone-chilling cold, and the constant, gnawing fear of being discovered before the mission even began. Despite the botched landing, the two men didn't waver. They made their way toward Prague, moving through the city's labyrinthine streets like ghosts. They found refuge with the remnants of the Czech resistance, brave families like the Moraveks, who risked the execution of their entire lineage just to give the paratroopers a bed and a warm meal. Inside the safe houses of Prague, the drop transitioned into a waiting game. Kubiš and Gabčík spent months observing Heydrich's routine. They watched his dark green Mercedes commute from his villa in Panensky Brezheny to the castle. They saw his arrogance, how he traveled without an armored escort, believing he had truly broken the Czech spirit. The paratroopers lived in the shadows of the very man they had come to kill. They saw the hangman from a distance, a tall, pale figure who walked with the confidence of a king. Every day they remained in the city was a miracle of luck and discipline. They were the spearhead of a desperate nation, two men who had fallen from the stars to strike a blow against the darkness. The drop was successful, the agents were in place, and the fuse of Operation Anthropoid had been lit. The hangman was living on borrowed time. The morning of May 27, 1942, was warm and deceptively peaceful in the Liben district of Prague. For Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík, however, the air felt thick with a tension that had been building for 5 agonizing months. This was the day. After weeks of surveillance, they had found the perfect kill zone, a sharp, hairpin turn where the road from Heydrich's country villa merged into the city. Here, any car, no matter how fast, would be forced to slow to a crawl. At 10:30 a.m., the two paratroopers stood at the curve. They tried to look like ordinary citizens waiting for a tram. Gabčík hid a thick raincoat under his arm, folded against a Sten submachine gun. Kubiš stood a few yards away, a briefcase in his hand containing 2 modified, high-explosive anti-tank grenades. A third lookout, Josef Walczak, stood further up the hill with a small pocket mirror, ready to flash a signal the moment the target appeared. Minutes turned into an eternity. Every passing car sent a jolt of adrenaline through their veins. They knew that if they failed today, they would never get another chance. The Gestapo was closing in on the resistance cells that sheltered them. It was now or never. Suddenly, a flash of light glinted from the hill. The mirror signal. A dark green Mercedes-Benz 320 convertible was approaching. As the car rounded the bend, the driver, SS Oberscharführer Klein, slowed the vehicle to navigate the tight turn. In the passenger seat sat Reynxard Heydrich, the hangman of Prague, arrogant as ever, traveling in an open-top car without a single armored escort. He felt untouchable. Gobchik stepped onto the road. He dropped the raincoat, leveled the Sten gun at Heydrich's chest, and pulled the trigger. Click. Nothing happened. The gun had jammed. A stray blade of grass or a faulty spring had silenced the weapon at the most critical moment in history. Time seemed to freeze. Heydrich, instead of ordering the driver to floor the accelerator and escape, made a fatal mistake. Fueled by his own ego, he stood up in the seat, drew his Luger pistol, and shouted for the driver to stop so he could confront his assassin. Seeing the disaster unfolding, Kubish reacted with lightning speed. He didn't wait for the car to stop. He swung the briefcase and pitched the modified grenade. It didn't land inside the car, but hit the rear right wheel and exploded with a deafening roar. The blast was immense, shattering the windows of a nearby tram and sending shrapnel tearing through the body of the Mercedes. Smoke and dust filled the air. Kubish, blinded by the debris and bleeding from a facial wound caused by his own grenade, scrambled for his bicycle and fled. Heydrich climbed out of the wreckage, seemingly unhurt at first, his pistol still aimed at the fleeing Gobchik. He gave chase for a few staggered steps, shouting, "Get that rogue!" before collapsing against the hood of the car. The shrapnel had ripped into his back, carrying bits of horsehair upholstery and toxic grime deep into his body. The curve of Liben had become a scene of absolute chaos. Gobchik vanished into a butcher shop, eventually escaping through a back door, while Heydrich was loaded into the back of a small delivery van by a passing Czech woman and rushed to Bulovka Hospital. The unthinkable had happened. The most powerful man in occupied Europe had been struck down by two men with a jammed gun and a single grenade. The curve was empty now, save for the twisted metal of the Mercedes and the spent shell casings. The blonde beast was wounded, the assassins were in hiding, and the city of Prague was about to experience a wave of terror that would stain the pages of history forever. The curve had done its job. The legend of the hangman was bleeding out on a hospital bed.
The hospital room in Prague smelled of antiseptic and dying hope. Reynxard Heydrich, the man who had orchestrated the mechanized slaughter of millions, lay broken by a handful of shrapnel and the filth of his own car's upholstery. On June 4th, 1942, the hangman finally stopped breathing. Septicemia, blood poisoning, had done what the jammed Sten gun could not. When the news reached Berlin, the fury of the Reich erupted like a volcano. Adolf Hitler was beyond reason. He had lost his favorite Iron Heart, the man he considered his most brilliant successor. The Führer's orders were immediate and apocalyptic. Kill 10,000 Czechs tonight, wipe them out, make the world tremble. While the mass executions began in the courtyards of Prague, the Nazi High Command wanted a more symbolic sacrifice. They needed a monument of terror. Based on a flimsy, false lead, a stray letter that suggested a connection to the paratroopers, the Gestapo turned its cold, murderous gaze toward a small, peaceful mining village called Lidice. On the night of June 9th, the village was surrounded. SS troops marched into the streets, their jackboots echoing against the stone houses. The families were dragged from their beds into the cold night air. The fury was systematic and devoid of mercy.
Under the yellow glare of truck headlights, every man over the age of 16 was lined up against the wall of the Horák farm. One by one, the shots rang out. 173 men, fathers, sons, brothers, were executed and dumped into a mass grave. The women were torn from their children, their screams filling the valley as they were forced onto trains headed for the Ravensbrück concentration camp. The children were sorted. A few Aryan-looking ones were given to German families, while 82 others were sent to the gas vans of Chelmno. But the Nazis didn't stop at blood. They wanted to erase the memory of Lidice from the face of the earth. They set every house on fire. They used dynamite to level the village church. They dug up the cemetery, scattering the bones of the ancestors. They diverted the stream and bulldozed the ruins until the land was a flat, scarred wasteland of dirt. Lidice was removed from all German maps. It was a message to the world. This is the price of defiance. Across the Protectorate, a wave of darkness took hold. Over 5,000 people were murdered in the weeks following Heydrich's death. The streets of Prague were plastered with red posters listing the names of the executed. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke and the silence of a terrified nation. Yet the fury of the Reich had an unintended consequence. Instead of breaking the Allies, the horror of Lidice galvanized them. The British government immediately nullified the Munich Agreement, recognizing the Czech Republic's right to its pre-war borders. The world finally saw the true, unmasked face of the Nazi regime. Inside the city, the two paratroopers, Kubisch and Gabčík, sat in a dark basement, listening to the radio reports of the massacres. The weight of the blood was almost too much to bear. They had killed the butcher, but the butcher's ghost was tearing their country apart. They knew their time was running out. The SS was searching every cellar, every attic, and every heart. The fury was coming for them, and it was being led by a traitor from within their own ranks.
The morning of June 18th, 1942, began with a heavy, suffocating silence in the heart of Prague. For 3 weeks, Jan Kubisch, Josef Gabčík, and 5 other paratroopers had been hiding in the dark, cold depths of the Church of St. Cyril and Methodius. They were beneath the very streets where the Gestapo was hunting them like wolves. They slept on stone floors, their breath misting in the damp air of the crypt, waiting for a chance to escape to the mountains. But that chance had been stolen. A fellow paratrooper, Karel Čurda, had broken under the pressure and betrayed them for 1,000,000 Reichsmarks. At 4:15 a.m., the silence was shattered. 800 SS troops under the command of Karl Fischer von Treuenfeld surrounded the church. They didn't come to arrest, they came to annihilate. The battle began in the prayer loft. 3 paratroopers, including Jan Kubisch, were standing guard. When the SS kicked in the doors, they weren't met with surrendering men, but with a wall of lead. For 2 hours, the 3 men held off hundreds of elite German troops. The loft became a slaughterhouse of marble and wood. Kubisch fought with a ferocity that stunned the SS, hurling grenades and firing his submachine gun until he was peppered with shrapnel and lost consciousness. He would die on the way to the hospital, never knowing that his partner, Gabčík, was still fighting below. With the loft cleared, the SS turned their fury toward the crypt. Behind a small wooden trapdoor and a slit in the stone wall lay the final 4 paratroopers, Gabčík, Valčík, Hruby, and Opalka.
The SS tried to storm the narrow entrance, but the paratroopers fired through the tiny vent, pinning down the German army in their own city. The last stand turned into a psychological war. The Nazis, frustrated by 4 men in a basement, brought in the Prague Fire Brigade. They thrust high-pressure hoses through the street-level vent, hoping to drown the paratroopers or force them out. The water began to rise. It was freezing, reaching their knees, then their waists. The paratroopers used a wooden ladder to push the hoses back out, a desperate, wet tug-of-war against an empire. The SS then threw tear gas canisters into the crypt. The air became a toxic cloud of stinging smoke. Choking, blinded, and shivering in the rising water, the 4 men realized the end had arrived. They only had a few bullets left. "We are Czechs," they shouted through the vent, their voices echoing over the roar of the water. "We shall never surrender." The SS eventually managed to blow a hole in the stone floor of the church, looking down into the dark, flooded tomb. They saw 4 shadows in the water. But before the Germans could fire, 4 distinct gunshots rang out from the darkness. Jan Kubisch, Josef Gabčík, and their brothers had made a pact. The last bullet was for themselves. They chose a soldier's death over the butcher's rope. When the SS finally hauled the bodies out into the sunlight of the Reslava street sidewalk, they were met with a sight that terrified them more than any army. These men had no fear. They had struck the heart of the Reich and died on their own terms. The last stand at the crypt was a tragedy, but it was also the birth of a legend. The assassination of Reynxard Heydrich remains the most successful act of resistance in occupied Europe. Operation Anthropoid had cost the lives of the paratroopers, the people of Lidice, and thousands of others, but it had proven that the hangman was mortal. As the sun set over the blood-stained stones of the church, the message to the world was clear. No matter how deep the darkness, there will always be those who choose to light a fire, even if they must burn along with it.